Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is returning guest Jordan Hall. He's a startup guy, or used to be a startup guy, and now he's a philosopher and theologian. And in this conversation, we talk first and foremost about his firsthand experience of Hurricane Helene, which utterly destroyed the infrastructure where he was living in Western North Carolina, and how in those days following that tragedy, community came together and identity exerted itself on a very ground up level to take over for the infrastructure and the systems that were utterly failing those people at that time. We also talk, and this is directly related to the identity of the West and the identity of America and how that is a response to the Second World War. We riff on a lecture by Alec Ryrie given at Gresham College, linked below, titled Hitler, Jesus, and How to Win a Culture War, in which Professor Ryrie argues that this is the age of Hitler, and the West used to have Jesus to look up to, and now we have Hitler to look down on, and how that galvanizes and creates our identity. And Jordan argues furthermore that Hitler actually won, or fascism actually won, the Second World War, and the institutions that were implemented in the wake of that conflict are sclerotic and doomed to failure imminently, and what we can do to find a more real identity that isn't based on running away from evil, but actually embracing and implementing the good. Jordan's a wonderful, wonderful guest. I always enjoy having him on. You can find our previous conversation also linked below, one of the best of last year. You can find him also on Twitter, and if you want to support the channel, there are links to do so down there in the description. Without further ado, here is Jordan Hall.
Hello, Dr. Braddock. How are you? Can you see me?
Braddock. It's Boyce.
Oh, Boyce, sorry. There's
Braddock.
somebody named Braddock, isn't there?
I don't know. There's the Chronicles of Riddick.
Ooh, that's nice.
Science fiction thing.
Is that was when Vin Diesel played you in the movie?
Yeah. They chose him to represent me. Wow, are you up in the woods? You have a different background than us.
I have a house now. My house is finished being built. We've been living here for about 2 months. And
wow.
Out my left window is town, this way. And then behind me and that way is the woods. So we're right at the edge where the woods meet the town.
About a year ago, there was a disaster that you were swept up into.
Actually, yes, exactly a year ago. We were in the middle of it right now, a year ago.
Yeah. What was that like?
I mean, it's a whole story. It was profound. It was definitely not simple, definitely not trivial. It was profound. There was all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, on all different levels.
I mean, we were without anything, without electricity, internet, water, gasoline, or the ability to drive cars anywhere for about 2 weeks. And then things slowly came back online, but we were without internet for 4 weeks. We were without power for 6 weeks, without water for 6 weeks. The roads, linearly opened back up. And so, yeah, we sort of dropped into the Stone Age and then worked our way back over time. But it was, I'd say the most telling point is that there was clearly on the evening of day 3 and the evening of day 2 and the morning of day 3, as the reality of the kind of the extremity of our circumstances landed, a sort of a spiritual choice of whether we were going to pull together or pull apart. And interestingly enough, the day 3 happened to be Sunday. And so everybody went to church. And in that context, everybody pulled together. Like, it was wild how at the end of day 2, basically nobody was doing community-based or public-based help. By the end of day 3, it was everywhere. There must have been 400 dots within a 5-mile radius of me. Like, restaurants were serving food, just feeding everybody. Churches were beginning to just spin up like crazy. It was wild. It was really amazing to see how that could happen.
That's an interesting context to test certain theories about civil war or other national disasters. And
totally.
And from the outside looking in, the response or lack of response or odd response from the federal government, and it was at the peak of an election too, where the federal government could really,
Yeah.
under Biden, could really prove itself, as subservient or as the servants of
A combination
the
of
whole
caring
country.
and competent. Yes.
Yeah. And
they did not.
what happened? Because there's so much noise that I'm never able to tell exactly what's what, because there's all this filtering of commentary, especially in a political environment,
Yeah.
to heighten positives or negatives depending on team and stuff. But from the inside looking out, or from the inside, what were these different layers of public service, community service, and
Well, the public part was absent entirely for at least 2 weeks. And we would have all died if it hadn't been for the private, like if people just showing up. Like it actually would have been catastrophic. Although we did see troops rolling in, like actual some sort of military,
like
probably
state
around.
level, maybe.
I don't even know actually. Somewhere around day 4 or 5, and that was nice because it created the sense of, okay, well, it's unlikely that we're going to have like riots, like massive riots. So the people were prepared to protect themselves and their property independently if it needed to go that way. But maybe the signature moment was helicopters were going crazy. Like we had helicopters flying like every 10 minutes. You hear a helicopter fly over, and then suddenly it was quiet for like 2 hours. And eventually we discovered that that's because Biden had helicoptered in, that had issued a blanket no takeoff order for the entire region as he helicoptered in. He did whatever sort of video spot that he did, and then he helicoptered out. And of course, the helicopters that were grounded were all actively doing rescue work, and so it's perfect, right? He did not helicopter in with resources. They did not bring help. I'm not sure if they ever brought help, to be honest. I'm not sure if the feds ever did anything helpful, as far as I know.
Other than stopping people.
Now, later, like as you start moving past the crisis, like when things are coming back online, I'm sure FEMA has written checks, although I don't know anybody who's received one. I'm sure they have. There's no question. And there was definitely a program where they were paying hotels and motels to let people stay there, which bridged a gap for a while. But I would say it this way: I would definitely not consider the federal government to be among the top 5 most relevant resources that help. And I would not expect such a thing going forward. Like I don't have an image of my mind of FEMA as like an organization that helps on the ground. If shit hits the fan, they're not going to help you. They might ultimately buffer the transition out. And they're doing things like buying property and stuff like that, which is a perfectly useful function. But if anybody has an image of them as like trucks full of food or, popping up shelters or helicopters flying in, no, as far as I can tell, 0%.
If I recall correctly, they had spent so much of their budget by that time of the fiscal year on illegal immigration, on housing immigrants and stuff like that.
You'll know more of that than me, because remember, for that period of time, I
you
was
were
off
out
the internet and very busy. So whatever happened there, I actually have no idea. It's so funny. I have absolutely no idea what happened in the world between September 29th and November 12th of that year. I mean, there was an election. I knew there was an election.
Yeah. What was that like and everybody around you, their world had collapsed into the immediate locale.
Yeah.
What was that like? How did that change your thinking? And
the definition of the locale was also really interesting because, like I said, for the first 2 weeks, nobody was driving. I mean, very, very few people were driving cars because you couldn't get gasoline. And suddenly locale meant like walking distance or biking distance if you had a bike.
Yeah.
And that was real. Like it was a real thing. Like, wow, I'm actually may have to rely on, for everything, by the way, including information, people who live no more than about 10 blocks from where I live. I mean, I actually walked the full perimeter on day 2 that you could walk, that was bounded by floods in every direction. So you walk that road is now washed out and there's no other way to go that way. Turn left, keep walking. Oh, that road's washed out. No, turn left. And then finally came back to, my house. And then telecommunications started, like we had Starlink actually. the Starlink started dropping in different locations, you could get some stuff. And
Elon came in. And
personally, probably. I think he actually was driving one of those like aliens.
Yeah, mech suits.
Unveiled. It was actually the unveiling of that. Nobody knew until then. Totally. That's what they were building. But it was interesting. I mean, there was basically 3 or 4 identities. So one identity were people who actually just got the heck out of Dodge as quickly as they could. And over time, that became more and more possibility. And so therefore, more and more people, I'd say roughly half my community, my neighborhood left. Second was people who stayed, but kind of like withdrew. And so you'd have these little clusters of people who kind of would like hang out in each other's houses, or even people who would just be solo, like by themselves in their house and didn't do a whole lot. They stayed like very low to the ground. And of course, the elderly tended to be more in that direction.
Yeah.
And then the third is you would have people who were local, like they would walk around and check on everybody who was local, or they would go to one of the local churches and volunteer there. And then the fourth was the people who were sort of pushing out into more of like the active crisis response, which my church happened to be a center for that. So everybody I knew was mostly of that fourth category. Like you'd wake up in the morning and you'd wake up in the morning and take care of all the things like figuring out how to get water to make your toilet flush and things like that. But once you finish that, you then go to church and then you get assigned like, okay, today, get your muck boots, get your shovel and your gloves. You're going to go dig these 3 houses out of mud. Wow. And then next day is you're going to go to this area of the church that you're going to unload boxes from these trucks that are coming in and organize them. And then the next is you're going to, whatever it is. So anyway, it was super, super interesting from my point of view. Obviously, I was sort of thinking about these kinds of things for a long time, and I got to live it in a just close enough to actual real, like serious bottom dropping out that it was real. I mean, people actually died. Many more people could have died, right? So you're right at the edge of, wow, this is actually life or death. And for quite a while, for like 2 or 3 weeks, people continued to die. So it was, a lot of skin in the game.
Did you have a child at that point? You had a newborn?
I had a 7-year-old.
Okay.
At the time, 6-year-old daughter. And then my wife was pregnant.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an extra stressor in your mind.
It was interesting. Yeah, I had to, and it was just early enough in the pregnancy. And by the way, we had lost the previous pregnancy. So she was pregnant, we had a miscarriage, and then she was pregnant again. And so I had to kind of tell a bunch of grandmas, keep an eye on Vanessa, make sure she doesn't, A, work too hard, or B, get too stressed.
Yeah.
So she was subtly sort of shunted out of physical labor and into, making food for people and stuff like that. She was definitely not going to sit around. There was no chance that was happening.
Yeah. Right. Wow. Well, is there a name for the disaster that you guys call?
We call it the hurricane or Helene or the flood, capital F.
Yeah.
It'll definitely have a name over the next decade because the tourists, we actually had this region had a huge flood in like 1916 or 1920. And so the tour buses would like drive around and show where that flood was because it was clearly a major marker. This flood was meaningfully bigger than that flood.
Oh, okay.
And so that industry will definitely find a way to name it.
Oh, yeah. I guess you guys can make some money on the back end after cashing in all your insurance. And so were you in the middle of building a house at that point?
I was. Yeah, it was framed.
Okay, this one that we're looking at.
The one I'm sitting in right now.
No, yeah. Okay. And it was fine? Relatively?
Yeah, we did not get any flooding, and we did not get hit by any trees, which was actually amazing because we're in the middle of the forest, so we could have easily.
Yeah. And so going into that, so our last conversation and much of your work, I think, could be categorized under the topic of identity. I think identity is one way in which you communicate the ideas that you are fostering and communicating.
Okay.
And watching that identity, and something that somebody recommend we talk about is the global identity, the identity of the West. What does it mean to be the West? And we were both at ARC in February, and there was a lot of projection or questioning about this Western identity, this Christian identity or Judeo-Christian identity. And And there was a talk that you commented on. I have your comments pulled up here, where an academic speaking kind of, you say your response was okay, boomer, because the way that he was talking about things, that the identity of the West is basically framed around not Jesus as a positive role model, but Hitler as the negative role model, and how so much of our identity and what's salient about who's good guy, who's bad guy comes around the Nazi or the Hitler identity or negative identity.
Yep.
And I'm watching that break down, but maybe it's not going to break down. And the way that young people specifically
break down.
Yeah, you and Jonathan Peugeot and Paul Vanderglay too, and me have a different point of view. People still react very strongly to Nazi-coded or fascist aesthetic garb, and we see a lot of young people and anons on the internet adopting that. And I think part of it's tongue-in-cheek, and part of it's this active process of breaking down that identity to find a new identity. So. I'm going to this global kind of point of view from the very local point of view.
Yeah.
And so like that's kind of like the bookends for wherever you want to go with our conversation.
Nice.
But that Nazi, just a couple weeks ago, some young Republicans were caught joking around about Hitler, and that was framed as a leftward hit piece against these fascist rightists. But the real contest was between the centrists, liberals, and the right wing. That was over who gets to police who's on side. And Matt Walsh was like, I'm going to be unified with everybody in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination. And then a lot of people are saying, no, we cannot have any relationship with these Nazis, this Nazi threat.
Right.
And it makes it seem like the right's never going to get anywhere because we're always so concerned.
Oh, I'm not worried about that. That's what do you call it? I'm trying to think. I mean, just to stick with the metaphor we were using, or the experience we were using earlier, the rain is falling. The hurricane is actually upon us, and the rain has been falling for a little while.
Yeah.
But it's going to keep falling because it's a hurricane. And if you look at the dam, like, well, that's a dam. It's a pretty big dam, actually. Pretty strong dam, pretty thick dam. The water's only halfway up. I'm not worried. I will tell you, the rain's going to keep falling. The dam will burst. That's what's going to happen. So the question is, what's the flood going to look like? Is the more relevant question. So that's sort of
what would the dam be to solidify that metaphor? Is that the ideology, like the dam?
The combination, so the post-war identity.
Yeah.
And the post-war identity contains roughly two dimensions. One dimension is the post-war institutional order, and the other is the post-war narrative, or the post-war mythos.
Okay.
And both are in the process, actually, of shattering. And so, we're kind of watching in real time as the little, the cracks are forming and water's trickling through. And if you know anything, by the way, about catastrophe theory, which, by the way, it sounds really big. It's literally the study of things like how balloons pop and how lightning bolts lightning. So it's a very practical thing. But there are certain kinds of phenomena that go from nothing seems to be happening to all at once something is happening.
Yeah.
And so if you want to know anything about catastrophe theory, you have to watch the subtle signs closely, because by the time it becomes not so subtle, it's already upon you in a very big way. So again, like the bursting of a dam or the popping of a bubble. So
the rules-based order, the global infrastructure.
The post-war institutional order. And they would call it the rules-based order is nice, because that's importing liberalism as the sort of the base assumption. Mm-hmm. But that everything, including things like the United Nations, NATO, the World Monetary Fund, like the Harvard University, like every single aspect of what I once had called the blue church. So that's that side. And then the other side is the post-war narrative, which says Nazis equal evil, and we can orient our entire society's value stack and identity on the basis of that.
So I guess there's several different catastrophes that could make that real. The first thing that comes to mind is if the dollar collapses, or like some sort of economic fallout that can't be stymied, like the 2008 financial crisis was able to be patched over and spread out via inflation over time. And then
and globalized, we should point out, right? It was an American crisis that actually spread everywhere in the world. A really fun graph to look at is look at the GDP to debt ratio of China prior to and after the global financial crisis. China absorbed an enormous amount of global debt during that period of time. Like we pushed it everywhere in the world and said, look, the whole thing's falling apart if you guys don't pick this up. And basically everybody was ready, willing, and able, with some grumbling, to pick it up. Yeah. We're obviously not there anymore. There's 0% chance that would happen this time around. But keep going.
Well, so what does the world... I'm trying to understand Dugin's multipolar theory. It's another thing that for some reason triggers the libs. They really have a hard time getting out of frame. But if you look at the rise of America, well, the fall of America as the global hegemon, and then who comes up once we decrease? I mean, it's China and Russia, maybe, but what does that really mean for us? What does it mean for how can Americans? Let's put it this way: how can Americans get ready for a different order?
Well, again, I think the thing to think about is first, who are we? Who are we? Is there such a thing as Americans? Is that actually a phrase that means anything? Or to use that quote from the movie, what kind of American, or which American are you? I can't remember exactly what.
What kind of journalist? Yeah. What kind?
And the content of that. So there's like the spirit, which is who are we? And then there's something like the content of that spirit, which is to say, what is the values hierarchy? What is the spirit orient us towards? How do we know what the good is and what the bad is and things like that? So the point is that we had figured that out in a particular way, a very secular way, in World War II, and we've been living in that world since then. And for the most part, up until like 10 years ago, most of that was unconscious, assumed, it was the water. You could just sort of move forward on top of that. About 10 years ago, that started to waver, and it became less obvious among smaller groups and then bigger groups and bigger groups. And now we're in the period of time where most of those assumptions are no longer able to be taken as assumptions, and we're beginning to accelerate into what is the ordinary state of affairs when you're exiting, when a catastrophe, when an identity collapses. There's a series of ordinary things that begin to happen. And like I said, in the context of the hurricane, for us, our identity had in fact actually collapsed. So on day zero, the infrastructure turned off. The institutional order turned off. You couldn't access the internet. You couldn't access fire. You couldn't access police. You couldn't access food. You couldn't access water. Like all the ordinary things that we assume are just going to be there suddenly weren't there all at once. And we were on something like momentum for not too long, for like 2 or 3 days, which is like a basic assumption that these kinds of things are temporary, and that the institutional order to which we've become accustomed is actually real, like fundamentally real, so that it will reestablish itself in a little bit. And so we basically had people who were kind of like hunkering down or chatting in the street. But by the end of the second day and into the beginning of the third day, there's this dawning realization of, okay, who are we? And how are we going to actually begin to build a functional identity? In this case, what are the new institutions? We actually going to need new institutions. Like how are we going to flush our toilets? Well, how do we? And it's weird to say that your neighbor with the swimming pool agreeing that everybody can bring their buckets into the swimming pool in the morning and fill them with water so you can fill your toilet with water so you can flush the toilet is an institution. That's an institution. And it's a mechanism whereby we have a set of agreements that allow human beings to solve basic human needs. And then we begin to scale up institutions. So what I witnessed first person was what happens when you turn off the existing institutional order, and then what happens and how does that reboot, or how do you build a new one? And that's at the level of institutions. And then, as I said, one step below that, and very driving was the narrative. Who are we? And there was clearly an inflection point. There was a point where we might be something like clan. We might be something like we're going to be protecting each other against other people who we have to consider to be hostile. And there were people like gathering at the grocery stores, and because where we were, there were a lot of people who had tried to escape, drove out to this neck of the woods, and then had to stop because there was no way to get any further. And they were just, we had like something like a sizable fraction of the population of the town were complete strangers who had no food, water, or shelter. It's like, okay, what's going to happen? Like, how's that going to work? And then what happened is on day 3, the new narrative established itself, which was at the end of the day, there was enough people who were, and I mean this quite literally, at church, who said, we're the people who help other people. And we're, as of right now, like literally at our church, as of right now, this church is a crisis response organization. Go. And here's how you do it. And so because that narrative had established, everybody kind of knew where to go. Like you knew what the right answer was. You when you encountered somebody who might have been a threat, the right response was, how do you help that person get their needs met? As opposed to, how do you shoot that guy who's about to take your stuff? Yeah. And it matters because narrative really is critical, because the world is, how do you say it right? The buzzing, blooming confusion of actual phenomenal reality is not obvious under any circumstances, right? We're constantly having to build biases to be able to actually simplify the infinite complexity we encounter into something we can navigate it all, right? And so if your basic bias is that guy over there is a potential threat, then a whole lot follows. If your basic bias is that guy over there is a potential person who I can help, then a whole lot of other stuff follows. And so we began this reboot of a very spontaneous, self-organizing, very community-based, and very, very help each other onto epistemology, both a being and identity, a beingness, and a way of understanding reality. Yeah. And so it followed. Now, if we step it up, I guess like 6 levels, as the world post-war identity collapses, the question is, what is the new narrative and what are the new institutional forms? And that is the question that is before us. And the key thing is that the more rapidly we recognize that that's the question, and we could do some interesting work looking back at how did the post-war order do what it did, because it's not neutral. We can be perhaps prepared to respond to those questions in a somewhat orderly fashion, maybe end up with a really good result. The actual collapse of the post-war order could end up being a very good result. But the default is not necessarily good. The default would be something like balkanization, tribalization, territorial conflict, etc. We can dig into the notion of the multipolar order if we'd like. I disagree with Dugan on this in a particular way, but I don't think it's an incoherent point of view. I think it's just not as deep as I think it should be. At least not the way he articulates it. He may actually be thinking at the right level. He just may not be saying it that way.
Before we go forward, I want to go back to the moment that you opened the conversation with about the night of day 2 and the morning of day 3. I'm wondering, to what extent was it spoken? What did it feel like to go in that phase transition from, I guess, oh shit, to getting the shit together, if you can pardon that phrase? But were you aware of the vibe or the spirit? And
yes.
Could you express or share that?
That's a very, very good way of putting it, actually, because in some sense, and I think most people were aware of the actual 2 different spirits were competing for that moment. That's a really good way of putting it. I mean, if you want to be quite practical, imagine that there's 2 songs that are playing simultaneously at a party for some reason. And there's a question of which song is the one that we're all going to end up dancing to. Or we're going to split into 2 parties, right? Dancing to 2 different songs. And so, for example, my wife, who is pregnant, says, hey, I've noticed that the people who are in the neighborhood were beginning to talk about the possibility of this might last a long time. Our food is already running out, like everybody, obviously, because it only lasts so long without refrigeration. What's going to happen? Like, is this going to get ugly? And what I said was, well, we're about 5 blocks from the city center, which means we're also relatively distant from the main grocery store. And so nothing's going to happen here until something happens there. But if disorder begins to happen there, then we know that we're in a circumstance that might actually be breaking the wrong way.
Yeah.
And of course, right on cue, we hear a gunshot, and rumor has it, people are sort of, hey, there's people trying to break into the grocery store, and it's like, okay, that's not good. So, I mean, point of fact, I actually get out my gun, prepared. I'm sleeping on the floor in the living room just in case, and I'm definitely not alone. Like, I heard lots of stories from other people who had felt that spirit, particularly if you have a pregnant wife, by the way.
Yeah.
But then similarly, for example, in the middle of that night, I remember I just woke up very obsessed with where were my people? How were my people were they accounted for? Were they okay? And so I lit a candle, and I took out a notepad, and I was just writing down the name of every single person and just a question mark. Okay, I need to know how they're doing.
Yeah.
So a sense of care, in this case, like a particular care.
Concern, yeah.
And a sense of how do we even know? Some of my friends live far enough away that I might not know for a long time. And I don't even know the current state of how bad things are. All I know is that, for example, the power and the water are out, and any trickle of information we're getting coming in is, or it might be over a long time. It's not days, it may be weeks, it may be further. We have no idea. That sounds really bad. What does that actually mean?
Yeah.
It wasn't until actually the next day, because our church happened to be right in the middle of where some of the biggest flooding was, right above that level. And so when we go to church the next day, which was already a bit tricky because we weren't going to walk there, we had to drive.
Why would you go to church? What was the reasoning? Habit?
That's a good question. Well, the key thing was, it was actually very practical. It's like, okay, what are we going to do? It's Sunday. Everybody at our church is going to try to get to church if they can. Mm-hmm. So it's by far the best way to find out how our people are doing, and by the way, find out what's going on and find out how to participate, like to engage. And so
you already had a habit.
Yeah.
So there was that implicit,
like a 2,000-year
history. Yeah. So that was just the next step to bring order to the week, to time, was the day of rest.
As it turns out, yeah, totally.
Okay. And everybody else had that habit too. So you knew that there was this, there's momentum that was just going to drive people there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, very nice. Yeah, so it was like a deeper institutional form that was not premised on any of the stuff that was had collapsed. And I should mention, by the way, the fire was an institutional form that continued. Like, the fire guys were working like crazy. They did not slow down, but they disappeared from our daily life because they were very, very involved in stuff. So like, if a house caught on fire, nobody was going to put that fire out except for the people on the block, because there was no resources available. But I don't want to say like they weren't doing their thing. They were doing their thing. Same thing with the police. Like, the police were there, but the magnitude of what we were dealing with was like 100 times more than the police could possibly deal with. And so it just clearly was a different kind of thing. But church was a sort of a deep substrate. And the kinds of things that church presents are things like fellowship, things like mutual care, but also things like, how do you organize a meaningful group of people?
Yeah.
We did mission trip like 3 months before. And so a bunch of people from the church got together and flew to Nicaragua and, did work. And one of the members of our congregation actually is a crisis response missionary. And so he's sort of, you're in charge now. What do we do?
Oh, okay. I was going to wonder how leadership structure arose and how you guys had the ability to do what you set out to do.
Well, I mean, leadership structure, let me say. So I'm watching this now from two registers. One register is being there, like first person. Second register as sort of a theorist of how leadership structures emerge in general. Okay. And it played out exactly as the theory indicated that it should, which is when there was a spirit of us, and that spirit of us was a spirit of us that was also helpful or of service, established itself. It was very clearly the case. And as, for example, because all the power was out, our church gathered in the area outside of our physical church building. Going inside the building was not going to work. And so therefore we were in the neighborhood. Our church happens to be in a neighborhood, right? So our next door neighbors are all just houses. Well, then the neighbors came out and they were also there. So when we were singing our music at the beginning, which is an interesting liturgy, like singing together as a very deep technology, We probably had like 3 times as many people in that particular church service as we ordinarily would, because we were just bringing people in from the much larger community, which then became part of the larger body who were participating. I mean, there are a number of people who were there at my church every single day for a month working that were not technically part of our church. And, most of them evaporated back into whatever world they were in afterwards.
Mm-hmm. No, just to highlight that you guys performed a ritual. You sang.
Yeah. We sang a lot.
So if we just look at the process of singing, it's really hard to worry about the toilet flushing and sing a song at the same time, right? So it melts away a lot of the worry and the concern by aiming everybody's attention.
Yeah.
And unifying and then hearing. And so it's embodying too, and you're seeing each other's faces. Well, there's a lot of really powerful things that are resetting the spirit.
Because remember, you're singing together. So that immediately creates a very basal felt sense of togetherness. And you're also singing to and or with God, which creates the vertical. So both the vertical and the horizontal are brought into very simple, like the most basic balance. Like if you need to reboot, if you have to reboot civilization, that's the right place to reboot it from. And then there was a very clear sense of, okay, we're all in. And as it turns out, this particular gentleman, Ben, I realized, oh, wait, I didn't know this is the case, but people in the church did. So the sort of the standing reserve of possibility identified him as being the person who was most likely able to give the best direction. So he just stands up and said, as of this moment, this church is a crisis response mission. And here's what we're going to do. And he just, today it looks like this, tomorrow it looks like this. We'll talk about the next day when that's relevant. One of the other guys happened to have been a logistics guy for the Army. Okay, so great. He suddenly sets up the whiteboard inside the room and starts, taking down tasks. I was basically, digging with a shovel and carrying things for a while. My wife couldn't be allowed to do heavy lifting, so and he sort of shuffled. And she actually ended up being the one who organized the church into a grocery store, because we started getting so many resources. And our church is in a neighborhood. It turned out to be a great place for food and supplies and gas and things like that.
How was your attitude? Were you grumbly? Were you happy? Were you numb?
All of it. Yeah, all of it for sure. I mean, some people had profound trauma, like had been physically in the process of trying to save people who they failed to save and died in front of them, like their actual neighbors. So we had that. We also had neighbors who weren't part of our church, but who had suffered profoundly. Their family members had died, or their lives had been swept away, and we were now directly engaging with them spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, and physically supporting them. You go into a process where you're kind of up to your hips in mud, trying to dig the mud out of somebody's house, and of course you're with your gas mask, because mold is starting to build up, and gloves, and you're pulling out like their grandmother's photo album, and it's all just falling apart in your hands. You can just feel the soulful destruction of it. That's all very heavy, and very heavy, like actual real heavy, like a nice, the legitimate heaviness. But then in the evening at about 5:00, as the sun's getting ready to go down, you put all that away. You drive to somebody's house. The only person who has a generator, we've kind of pooled gasoline to keep it running, the one operating freezer and refrigerator, and 30 people are at their house with candles having dinner together. And we actually all sing, and then we have dinner. Well, we actually all sing, and then we pray, and then we have dinner together. And there's a feeling of a return to proper wholesomeness, like a recognition of, actually, this is extremely good, necessary, important, and the fact that we've drifted away from this is demonic, to be very precise. Bad, but not just a little bit bad, but profoundly bad. And the sense of, there's so many. This is just the aesthetics pop off. So we also the kids dropped back into the mid 1970s. The parents we're gathering at church, we're working. The kids are kind of like forming a feral group. They're just doing their own thing. Sometimes they're helping carry things around. Sometimes my daughter would just drop in with one particular lady, and she would go and like drive out and bring care packages to neighborhoods. And she was kind of handing things out. But one moment, by the way, remember, she's 6. I just remember this one time that I'm carrying a pallet. Actually, I think I was setting up the Starlink that we'd finally gotten at our church. And I look and I see her drive by on a motorcycle, barefoot with her hair just blowing in the wind.
What?
I guess one of the kids, one of the kids over there had a motorcycle and she just wanted to drive it. I think it was an electric motorcycle, not like gasoline. I couldn't quite tell. But I just looked and I just had this image of like seeing that same image 40 years ago, when I was a kid, and just not having like, okay, that's just where we are. Whatever, that's fine. That is within the zone that I'm not going to have any concern. Now, obviously, now that A, wouldn't happen, and B, I'd probably be concerned. But I tell you, greater shit than that went on during this period of time.
Yeah.
And so it was a sort of a resetting of what your habits or your biases are on what is normative, and reorienting them towards the more fundamental normative, what is actually strong foundation, and then living on the basis of values that were not superficial but were foundational, and then coming up from there. So fashion was not a big deal, but protection, like actually having appropriate protection so people weren't getting sick, was a very big deal.
Yeah. What is how did that change? So Christianity's been around for a long time, and it's gone through a lot of schisms, and we have this whole denominational mess and a lot of futzing around with words. Do we put the word here? We put the word there, and then a lot of conflict. In a time like that stresses the belief system probably to its core. What did you learn about your religion by it going into becoming the capstone of the day and the teller of time and the resetter of spirit?
Yeah.
And why Christianity? Did it deepen your understanding of what the reality within Christianity is?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. So let me see if I can pull out some things in an orderly fashion. Well, I'll give you maybe 4 images. The first image is somewhere around day 4. It's getting close to night, so we're beginning to lose light, and of course we don't have much artificial light. And a guy drives up in a truck, pulling a trailer. He gets out of the truck and he says, "Hey, I need to drop off all these supplies." And I go, "Where are you coming from?" He goes, "I came here from Tennessee. All the roads are out, so I've been driving for the past 2 days." And he's like, when I knew things were in trouble, I drove to the nearest Walmart and loaded up and came out here to help. And on my way, I would stop and ask where to go because it was all word of mouth, and people pointed me in your direction. And I said, why did you do that? And he said, "God told me to." That was it. Like, very clear. That was very simple for him, that he was willing to put himself at that level of duress because as far as he was concerned, that's how the world works, and God told him to. And he was extremely not alone. Okay, so second image is maybe day 14. We now have we've set up the church as a grocery store. Bottom floor is grocery store, top floor is more like clothing. We've got something like 500, 600 people coming through the church on a daily basis doing work. We've got 7 or 8 different crews. We now have helicopters that are flying in not too far down the road and then driving people over to us. And we actually have serious missionary organizations showing up.
Yeah.
And there is definitely a distinct denominational difference between some of the groups that are showing up, because I have a conversation with a group of college kids that I'm surprised by some of their answers to certain questions. And somebody over here says, "Oh, they're this kind of denomination. They don't believe in these kinds of things." I didn't even know that. It mattered zero. Right? It mattered zero. People who were called to come came. There was no ability for us to say no in terms of like, "You're here." There was an ability to say, "We don't need your stuff," or, "Hey, we've moved from open carry to not open carry," for example. And if that's not your vibe, those guys over there are open carry, so that's fine. Like, over there. But we did, by the way. We moved from open carry to not open carry.
What was the decision behind that, or the spirit, the clip?
It was actually very straightforward. For the first couple of weeks, it was like, hey, there might actually be a real threat because we've got lots of resources here, so we need to be prepared for that. And then after that, it was we're spending most of our time now actually going into places with people who don't know us.
Yeah.
You shouldn't have a gun, like an obvious gun. They have a gun because we live in Western North Carolina, and they know you probably have a gun, but the fact that don't have it on your hip indicates that you're here to help more than anything else. Yeah. For example, it's very practical. And so,
odd detail.
It was incredible to see how willing the people were to come and put like enormous amounts of resources into helping. The third was like the deepest is something like, it's a very long story, I don't want to go into it, but something like actually witnessing at a spiritual level the presence of God in how he works through people in particular contexts in a way that is not commonplace. Like, it's not sort of theological. It's not governed by doctrine. It's actually saying, oh, yeah, I kind of tend to forget God is real and God works in the world, and God works in the world through people. And if you just pay attention, you can see it. And that's deeper than all the other stuff. It's like the deepest place. And having enough circumstances to see that, like several circumstances to see that, is great, because you're more capable of not getting caught up in things that are sort of less or more superficial. And then the last is I later, not exactly then, but later had an opportunity to have a conversation with an Orthodox priest who lives in this area. And he said, so his experience, because obviously they're not in our neighborhood, they're further away, but also we're in the same category, like in the same hurricane. He said, one of the biggest results for me of this hurricane was I no longer know who a Christian is, which is a very, very big deal for an Orthodox priest. Because for an Orthodox priest, a Christian is somebody who I can take communion with, or who I can give communion to, who I can, there's a very serious protocol, and I'm not in that category. But he was in the presence of God and the action of God's people showing up who definitely were not Orthodox and nonetheless were 100% doing what they believe God wanted them to do. And it was clear to a Christian, yeah, and that's actually what God wants you to do. Like, we can both agree God is here right now and you're doing his work. In other words, that deeper register was so present that for him it was like wow, I'm kind of in this weird disorientation now, because the doctrine is useful, the ecclesial divisions are maybe necessary in ordinary time, but they aren't the actual most fundamental level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you need to have, it's very valuable to have that tradition and to have cordons or kind of lines that distinguish the proper way to perform and the dialogues through time with the church fathers and the theology that keeps that alive. It keeps it present. And then in times of luxury, you can argue and fiddle and have great discussions and stuff like that. But those necessarily have to be suspended when reality is like on that basic level.
Yeah. In fact, oddly enough, last night at house church, I had a really profound insight that more or less what we're actually talking about is just reality. We're talking about how do we become fully, properly in relationship with reality. And that the primary problematic, something like the fall, has to do with our not fully being in reality. Something like us doing things like evaluating reality with some set of purposes and intentions or plans, and being in a place of slight remove. A simple example is when you're having a conversation with somebody and you notice that they're thinking about what they're trying to say. They're trying to make sure they're saying something so that either, if you're talking with the salesman, for example, that they have an agenda, they have a purpose they're trying to accomplish, and they're selecting their words, meaning they're not present to the conversation. They're not present to what the actual possibility of the conversation really is. They're trying to ultimately control the conversation in some fashion. And the point is this is not just a salesman thing. This is basically everybody. Like, this is actually the human condition, is that we are separated from reality by our own ability to be meta to reality, our own ability to observe and judge and strategize and plan. And that is in fact the primary problem, that the primary challenge is how do we religio, right? How do we reconnect ourselves with actual reality and not find ourselves continuously taken off on these crazy journeys of our own fancy, which, by the way, looping us all the way back, is what happened after World War II.
Yeah. In your, and I'll link it in the description, but in your response to that lecture about Hitler being we're in the age of Hitler, like everything's defined around Hitler. You go pretty deep. You're like, we've lost religion way before that. It seems like in times of crisis, religion can reassert itself because reality reasserts itself.
Oh,
but when we're so swept up in, watching the rain fall and still trusting the dam or thinking about the dam, worrying about the dam, we still are in a meta remove, like what's going to happen and what does this signify, all these things signify. But if we go back to a deeper orientation of the West, going back to ARC, they talked a lot about this thing called Judeo-Christianity and what is the West, and it was kind of a little bit religious, but they really wanted to be secular. And I appreciate the work that Jordan and his cohort are trying to do by bringing up these questions and establishing a place for people to connect with each other and talk. But the center stage is dominated by this aged form, this corporate form, these signals to the post-world order. It's still, and that's the interesting thing, and this is always difficult to bring up because it shatters the conversation so easily. The role of Israel in our mythology and this constant question of what do we owe Israel, and do we owe Israel people will say like Israel is the foundation of the West, and you're like, but what is this Israel thing, and why is it so important? And you see this constant mixing of Israel's this idea, and it's the bedrock of Christianity, and then there's the state thing. So we're going back and forth and back and forth, and the amount from the young people, the amount of distrust of that. Of Israel and maybe you could say anti-Semitism. I think it's an expression of that the deconstruction of Hitler. If Hitler's Satan, then the Jews are the sacrificial victim, and so we have to hold them both in really high regard. But in reality, that's not helping me with my with getting a loan. It's not helping me connect with people that are my people and stuff like that. So I'm wondering, how do we navigate that? Because you see it constantly, this real dread and worry about anti-Semitism reasserting itself and Israel being such a captivating symbol that we can't even it's really hard to even talk about because it's such a powder cake.
Well, let's talk about it and see what happens. Fortunately, I don't care if everybody's mad at me. You seem to be relatively thick-skinned. So, all right, I'll point out one thing, and then I actually want to lay out some concepts and work back. So the first thing to point out is that you can kind of see these two figure eights of Israel. So one of them is, it is simultaneously the most particular child of the post-war environment. And it is the birth. It is birthed out of the post-war environment in lots and lots of different ways. Now, as you say, not only as the sort of the most clear antithesis of the Nazis, but also just as a function of the way that the institutional order was able to do things over time. Mm-hmm. And its actions over the past, in the Gaza context, begin to most fundamentally violate the norms established in the post-war institutional order in a variety, in enough ways to be salient. And so it creates that horizontal tension. So in the moment of kind of like being the poster child of the post-war institutional order, and also being something like an extremely high bias violator of that exact order, it's almost kind of perfectly symbolic. The
exception and the rule.
Yeah,
simultaneously.
Exactly, simultaneously. And then we can do the same thing vertically, which is, as you say, we have something like a 6,000-year-old story that grounds all the way, and upon which the West is at least meaningfully built, on one side. And then on the other side, you actually have sort of an ordinary secular nation state on the other side, right? So something like the exception and the rule in that dimension as well. And so it's just, okay, that's that. So let's hold that there, because I think there's something about the idea that Jerusalem is the actual center of the world. Like, objectively, it's the center of the world. I don't mean the sense of like if you turn a globe and try to center, obviously every point's the center of a sphere if you orient on it, but that all meaningful activity is going to be centered there. It's not surprising.
Are you saying that as like something that you believe, or something that is foundational to our story as Westerners?
Well, I guess that they follow. So I believe it, and therefore I believe that it's foundational to our story. Okay. The second, is dependent upon the first, obviously, from my point of view, and perhaps you will agree with that at some point. But let me just lay some concepts out, because there's like 5 or 6 that I think are really useful, and here's the key idea. We actually have to get to some very basic ideas, because the middle layer, the idea of nation state, isn't helpful. Even like the idea of Israel, qua Israel, because there's like 19 different things you might attach to that word, isn't helpful. You're talking about the Jacob's other name. We're talking about this, the 12 sons of Jacob. What are we talking about? All right. So here's so one idea is the sacred, and this is the point. Is trying to demystify a lot of these terms. So the sacred is basically is at its most basic level a ray, like this in geometry, like a line that has an arrow. It's a distinction, and that distinction has a directionality. So if you have 2 things, and one is more valuable than the other, that is an example of the sacred. The thing that is more valuable is sacred in relationship to the other thing. And you know this because we have another term, sacrifice. You will sacrifice the lower in exchange for the higher. And so the sacrifice is both the logical consequence of a values hierarchy. The lower is sacrificed for the higher. But it is also the ontological methodology whereby that values hierarchy is instantiated. So you both know that it is the case, and you also make it firmly in reality.
Yeah.
So then the next piece would be something like, we have to go a little bit more robustly with our examples. Let's say that you are given, you've been planning your child's birthday party, and your child's 7th birthday party is coming up this weekend. And then your boss comes in and says, hey, I need you to do a presentation to the board of directors this weekend. And by the way, if you do well, it's going to be a super big promotion for you. All right. You're now given an opportunity to find out what it is you worship. What is higher, what is sacred to you, and what is to be sacrificed. And then you're going to make a choice. And when you make that choice, you'll simultaneously know what do you worship, and you will know what your values hierarchy is, and you will actually instantiate them. You will now be living, that's your identity, right? You'll now be living in that world. You'll be living in the world where you didn't get the promotion, but you went to your kid's birthday party. Yeah. You'll be, and you're now that person, which by the way is a whole timeline. And you just separated from getting that fancy boat. It's not happening anymore. But your kid might actually come to see you in the old folks' home, right? Choose your own adventure. Or the other timeline, right? So that's the idea, right? You're actually changing the nature of the ontological reality in which you live, the identity that you inhabit, and identifying what your values are. Okay, so these are key elements. And then I want to just go one more big one, and that has to do with something like the knowledge of good and evil. Like, what was actually the content of the tree? And when we ate of the fruit of the tree of good and evil, and therefore, by the way, fell. What the heck's going on there? And what's going on there is what happens after World War II. What happens in the post-war narrative? What happens is we, on the basis of our own ability to discern what is good and evil, oftentimes as a consequence of a searing example of evil, order our values hierarchy on our own basis, using our own capacity to make these distinctions ourselves. So we now identify what is sacred and what is profane. We say, hey, Nazis, That's evil. And things that look like Nazis, we can identify, and that's evil too. And things that look not like Nazis, we can identify, and that's good. And we are living in the world of the knowledge of good and evil. And the key thing is we're the ones who are making those decisions. Those are human distinctions that we're making in the world. And the reason why I'm putting that out there is that is a secular way of solving that problem. And obviously, if you think about it, we're the ones who are doing it. It's human beings, individuals and groups who somehow come to an agreement, oftentimes unconscious, about what their values hierarchy is, and then begin to navigate in that fashion. And then the last piece is just to say, and by the way, you'll notice that usually to accomplish that last part, a tremendous sacrifice is necessary to have produced simultaneously the ontology. Tens of millions of people die in World War II. Millions of Russians, millions of Germans, millions of Jews, and Japanese on the other side of the world. A tremendous sacrifice. What did that tell us? That tells us what our values are. It also creates an ontological fork. We live in that world. And when you make a tremendous sacrifice on the altar of some identity, you're now doing something which is of the category, and it's yours. You're the one. Humans are the ones who are making the decisions. You're now engaging in something like idol worship. You're sacrificing on the idol of whatever identity it is that is designing this hierarchy of values. And so our idol was something like liberalism, humanism, the United Nations, whatever the content of was on the other side of the Nazis that they could identify with as themselves. And then post-World War II, what begins to formulate? What's the seed structure that begins to formulate the post-war institutional order? And so we're actually engaging in a form of idolatry where the sacrifice was now identified as what the sacrifice is. What's the meaning of the sacrifice? Why did all these people die? Well, they died to defeat the Nazis and to establish peace in the world. And that's literally like the United Nations has that written down.
Yeah. There's something poetic it's scratching at the back of my head about when you talk about idolatry. And if you look at what was formed during the post-war consensus, so all these 3-letter agencies for some reason, like these egregores, these things that have names that are then compact. There's something interesting there. All these titans and these titans and like primordial gods came and populated the world in that time.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The spirits. We can actually just maybe add spirit to the equation.
Yeah.
Spirit and identity, it can be very cleanly, like they're very close, roughly the same, very close. And name, by the way, capital N name, something that can be named, and the name fits, like it actually works, has an identity, and that is the name fits because it has an identity and it has the spirit. And so there's a world that gets built out of the sacrifice, and that world has a hierarchy of spirits. That's the institutional order spoken more cleanly. And the hierarchy of spirits coordinates with the hierarchy of values. So certain, what is the content of the FBI, for example? What is it? Oh, wait, now we're not hunting gangsters. Now we're playing some role in how the civil rights movement works, for example. And by the way, what's the content of the CIA? We get closer to the center. Like now you're moving kind of into the mystery part of this. And the key thing is that kind of an identity structure, a secular identity structure. I mean, the word secular is very nice because it tells us exactly what it is. It's a notion with the notion of cycles. It's associated with the notion of that which lives and dies. And so a secular identity structure lives and dies. That's what it does. And so, and I can kind of go into detail as to how the narrative unravels and how the institutional order unravels, if you'd like.
Well, can I ask a question if it's not going to derail you?
No, go ahead.
When you speak about this form of establishing a value order between good and evil based on our gnosis or our knowledge, and then we're sacrificing to an idol. Is there any other way?
Yes.
For that to have happened?
Yeah. So nice, thank you. So if you have idol on the left side, the right side would be icon. And you can use everything through that lens. So if I have if my wife, if she's an idol, what that does is ultimately my attention terminates on her. She ends up being the place at the top of the values hierarchy. Or my children, or my money, or my job, or science, or our sacred democracy, whatever it happens to be, right? It's at the moment where you've established something where the values hierarchy has a terminus, and that terminus is on itself in some particular way. In an icon, the values hierarchy always points towards the higher. And so my love for my wife is my love for my wife, but also points me to that which is higher than her and than me. Right? So it has a transcendent characteristic.
Yeah.
And let's say, of course, that transcendent characteristic can only ultimately terminate on the actual highest. And so the icon trajectory is a values hierarchy where the top of the values hierarchy is the actual highest. Obviously, as a Christian, for me, that is the triune God. And then everything is ordered from that direction down. Notice, by the way, because it is in the transcendent, it also is not grounded in the temporal. It is anchored in the eternal, and therefore is not subject to the birth-death cycles of the seculum. It will instantiate itself in the world in which we live, right? As it immanentizes itself, it'll instantiate itself in the context that we're in, but it's not grounded in that context. And so it has the ability to resurrect and renew. And it does not need to have a sacrifice in the same way that an idol has to have a sacrifice, because Christ already sacrificed himself. The greatest possible sacrifice has already been made fully. So you have something which is simultaneously anchored in the highest. That anchor is transcendent, therefore eternal, and therefore not subject to the vicissitudes of time. And the sacrifice that ordinates that entire values hierarchy has already been made, and it's the biggest sacrifice that could possibly be made. So that's the right hand. Right, so that's the choice that you're faced whenever you're in this moment. Now, remember, when you're in the middle of a secular cycle, when you're in the middle of a secular identity, actually, let me give you another frame. This is very practical, like a very simple frame, because I think it's very helpful. I was thinking about this a lot over the past few weeks. Let's go with like Star Wars. And we could also go with college football if you'd like. Those are both perfectly good examples that I happen to have. Like nice first person or a startup company, Google, right? All of these things. So what happens is all real identities, there's a whole other category of assemblages, but we'll ignore them for the moment. All real identities, things that have real names, things that have real spirit, are actually coming from this eternal hierarchy. They're coming from God. Google came from God. Google, when it first was incepted as a group, an actual live group of a small group of people living in a relationship, was holding some kind of identity. A team, like your college football team. And this run the clock way back, like at the beginning of the foundation of college football. A bunch of college kids have some sort of vague notion of a fun thing to do. They get out on the pitch in the fall. It's perfect weather, and they play a game, and it's really fun. And then next season, they're like, the next actual season, like the actual fall comes around. They're like, hey, remember that? And they get together, and some of the people hadn't graduated, and they instantiate it. There's a spirit to that. There's an identity. There's a life to it. And life is nice. There's a life to it. And what's interesting is that it doesn't have the purposes are somehow outside of itself. The purposes are for the fun of the game. Right? Why are you playing? I'm playing because it's fun. I have fellowship, and the purposes, by the way, can be extremely rich. Some people are playing because they want exercise. Some people are playing because they want to attract the girl over there who's watching the team. It doesn't matter, right? The purposes are very, very rich, and there's an aliveness to it. And then something happens. Let's say after a while, there's a bunch of people who are playing. It's becoming a little bit more formal, but still alive. It's still an actual spirit. And then Yale, in this case, says, you would like to really win that game against Harvard. I have an idea. Let's get a graduate student who really knows how to play and have him come and teach us how to play better. Which is to say, you subject the spirit, you subject the identity to your own purposes. You shape it. You optimize it. Right? You reorient the values hierarchy with a new value at the top. You idolize it. You make it into an idol. Now, here's the key thing to take away. that works. Very important to recognize that move is made because it works. You get exactly what you want. I mean, you may not win the game, but at the end of the day, you probably do. And
I don't see any world where God doesn't want that development to happen. I mean, there's always that concretization, and like that's how you finish a book. Like you don't just write a book. You write a book and then you edit the book. You shape it and you contend with that.
But let's go with the we can move there too. Let's go with writing a book. So in the first movement, there's something like the book is writing itself through you.
Yeah.
And you're deeply participating in
you're
something
in a flow state.
Transcended. Okay.
Yes.
Now you've had a successful book. Now you've got an audience. Now you got a name. Now you have an identity. Now you've got a jacket with elbow patches. And now maybe you have the ability to make some dough. So now you got to write that second fucking book.
Yeah.
But it ain't flowing through you anymore. But fortunately, you've developed simultaneously. You've got skills and having words fit together in a way that compels the person.
And you have the habit. Yeah.
You've got to have anybody. You've got a publicist. You got an industry. You've got an audience, right? And so you can crank out that second book. And the second book might also still actually be pretty close to the reality of what books are supposed to be. But somewhere by the time you get to the seventh book in the series and can't quite finish it, you've noticed that something has gone deeply, deeply awry. And the key thing is you've left the realm of what God wanted to do, and you've entered the realm through the inevitable consequence of what happens when you're now living through you, through your own intentions and purposes,
which is caught in the cyclical speculum.
And in the beginning, it looks good. Right? In the beginning, your college football team wins. In the beginning, you're making money as an author. You get to live the life as an author. You may even actually become a famous author. You might get all kinds of like cool things like women like you, which they didn't, used to like you when you were a nerdy writer. And you kind of feel like, well, I'm winning. The thing that I think is the thing that I want, I'm actually accomplishing that. But what you've entered into is the secular cycle, which means that at some point, and particularly in places where new people are entering into the spirit, like in a college football team, several generations down the road, now kids who want to play football, they all have to try out. There's professional coaches, there's a whole sort of organizing, and they're entering into a completely different spirit than the original spirit that gave birth to this thing, right? The original potency, the aliveness. And then, by the way, eventually you're going to be in a situation where kids are actually getting paid $10 million to play college football. And everything in the spirit has been completely exited. And it has nothing but the pure kind of zombified animated carcass. And you could do that with anything you love. Like if you loved something, the first initial relationship with it was of love. Like you loved Star Wars and it came out. You loved the first Harry Potter book. You loved, some band that you really appreciated. Honestly, even a person, you love your wife. As soon as you instrumentalize them, you will notice that the thing that you loved is precisely the thing that died the moment the instrumentalization occurred. And this is, by the way, like that's a universal principle I'm deploying.
Was there a word for this?
No, I just figured it out a little while ago, like over the past month. I was thinking about this weird theological problem of why.
Gotta instrumentalize this, man.
You can coin it, sir. I give it to you entirely. Why did that come up? So the thing that was in my head was just thinking about spirits, identities, and the difference between an identity that is alive, an identity that's ultimately oriented towards God vertically, like it's an icon. And what happens when an identity falls, right? When we pull it down, we have the unique capability to take a spirit and pull it out of its proper place because we instrumentalize. We have from a theological perspective, we have the imago Dei. So therefore we have a certain capacity to impose our will on the world. And as soon as we do that, the entire situation gets inverted and we're now living in it. We're living in the world of our own creation. We're living in the post-war environment, for example. And then we're captured in the way that downward cycle, this reciprocal closure between a spirit that is increasingly denatured by our desire to have it fulfill its purpose and the process of a human being entering into that spirit, becoming denatured and captured and corrupted by the spirit. And this is why we constantly see things like post-war, our institutional forms were reasonably healthy. NASA was actually a pretty functional institution. It pulled off some amazing things with the Apollo program. But now it's not. Why is that? The reason is mostly what I just described. That when you exit the realm of the icon, when you exit the realm of the divine hierarchy, then you've produced something which is going to get, it's the cut flower. I love how the C.S. Lewis actually gave that metaphor. And if I see a flower out in the garden, it's a beautiful flower, but I can't subject it to my purposes in the way that I would like. I can't make it into I can't bring it into my kitchen, and I can't make it into a bouquet. So I cut it. Okay, well, same thing, bifurcation. At the moment that I cut it, it becomes massively more available to my purposes, and it's actually dead and in the process of corruption unto just being kind of a weird goo that I have to throw away. So use that as the metaphor for everything of that sort. So it's important because in World War II, this is the tweet that kind of brought us into this conversation. I made the argument that the Nazis won World War II. Because if you look at the depth, and here I have to make a distinction between fascists and Nazis, by the way. The Nazis were in some sense fascist, but they were also more than that. They were also deeply, deeply committed to overturning the Christian world and the restoration of a pre-Christian pagan world. This is why they had kind of like the Roman images, why the swastika got pulled out of the Aryan past. Like they're orienting back to a deeper, deeper register. And of course, in that pagan world that they lived in, they were worshiping other kinds of gods. They were engaging in sacrifice to produce these hierarchies. Now, given my argument, all of those are inevitably going to corrupt and fall, and therefore, by the way, require another sacrifice. But the key move, this is the proposition, I'm making the argument. I'm not sure how much it matters, but it's interesting if it really is the case, that the fact that the German nation itself was on the sacrificial altar bothers the Nazis not at all, because their victory was actually the movement of the West from a vertical Christian-centered order to one that is fundamentally founded on idolatry, on restoration of the principalities, or at least temporarily. And in that sense, they accomplished their objective absolutely perfectly, which is to say we've actually been living in that world since then.
Before we go deeper, you helped me to understand the mimetic power of Francis Fukuyama's the title of his book, The End of History.
Yeah.
Right. People make fun of that because like history re-exerted itself, but if you look at under the lens of idolatry, like that was the end, the orientation of the entire West was this end of history, like not end, like history's over, but it's like, this is the end. This is the telos. This is what we're trying to accomplish. Costco's everywhere. Capitalism, democracy, liberal democracy, like everybody's got a voice, everybody's equal under all these different terms, and these structures that facilitate that offload all of the community work that we need to do, the meeting at church, the understanding who friend is and enemies are, and then the pact to make friends, not just to recognize friend and enemy, but I'm going to act as a friend to everybody. Like that's what church seems like in your example actually did. It didn't erase friend and enemy. It caused everybody to become the principal friend. I'm going to embody friendship. But that is what we were, and the institutions of charity were taken out of the church and given to our tax dollars. That's U.S. aid, which is like we are the government's going to do it all for us. We're not going to need to, and then that creates us as client classes, and then politics goes out and just devours all relationships, or all relationships are now subsumed into politics.
Yep.
So with that vision on the table, how could you concretize this, how the Nazis caused that to come to be, or caused that idolatry to come to be? Does that take place within your example? Like if that's what liberalism ended up wanting to do, right, how did the Nazis kick that off? Right.
So, I mean, we could look at, I'll do the first lens first because it's the simplest in terms of articulation and the least satisfying in terms of the way the mind might want to grasp it, which is they executed a human sacrifice and understood kind of what they were doing. All right, so let's take a. So that's the first point. The first point is that in a kind of the most fundamental symbolic way, what they did is they initiated a human sacrifice on terms of, and they set the stage of what the terms of the battle were going to be. So let's move to that second piece. Like, what are the terms of the battle? Yep. But before I get there, I actually want to make sure I set the stage for the church, because the church was present. But as I mentioned in that tweet, the church was almost already dead anyway. And so the state, the key thing here is the ascension of the state. Regardless of the particular formal infrastructure, ultimately at the end of the day, liberalism, communism, and fascism are all the same. They are what you just described, right? They are cut flour. They're what happens when you take relationships, human relationships, and you instantiate them as formal relationships in some, or formal relationships in some kind of
effective altruism,
optimization, right? Exactly. So you take a snapshot of reality and you put a human schema on top of that reality, and then you begin the process of endeavoring to optimize that against whatever cybernetic control structure that you happen to be operating under. Right. So if you're a communist, you use a communist cybernetic control structure, which has a whole bunch of parameters of how you propagandize and narrate it, and also different techniques that you can use. If you're using the liberal cybernetic control structure, you're using a different set of parameters, but it's still at the end of the day the same kind of thing. Right. Mm-hmm. That's the really hard thing for people to swallow, which is of the category. As soon as the Nazis made it that the church was absolutely blown out of the water. There was no way the church could stand against the thing they were doing, because they were not doing something that was in the ordinary secular environment. They were actually doing something that was, at the end of the day, establishing a new spirit, a new way of being inspirited. They were saying, hey, and I mean, practically, we're going to worship pagan gods. But if you see the flood of what happens when a body, Germany, which is in the process of complete collapse, and beginning to develop when a new spirit is invoked, and that new spirit is invoked intentionally, what you saw was that there was an arms race began to be developed. That what was happening was so powerful and so fast, so capable of innovating in the technical dimension. Right? It was so ruthless in going towards pure, unadulterated power, that it forced everybody else to begin to do the same kind of thing. And so it caused, you may recall, the Soviet Union nearly got destroyed by the German war machine, and Stalin had to radically up his game in terms of aping a lot of techniques to produce something. And what happened there was a different kind of identity. And the Russia pre and post war was a different kind of thing, which enters into its conflict with the West, with the liberal order.
Well, so the same thing with what did Eisenhower call it? The military-industrial complex was the spirit that was evoked in response to Japan and to the Nazis.
We had to invoke our own pagan deities. And we had to suddenly invoke the military-industrial complex. And I don't know if you know the history of it, but during the period of World War II, the entire American economy was actually was a command economy. It was being run through the White House. Right? I actually had a professor who was on that board, and people were issued little cards, ration cards, and we turned the entire American economy into a war machine. So what the Nazis did is said, hey, there's going to be a war machine. That's what's going to happen. And if you don't participate in the war machine game, we're going to kill you. We're going to just utterly destroy you, because we're playing the deepest deepest power game that can be played. We're going all the way to pure power. And we know that as part of that process, sacrifice is part of what happens. We're establishing a new hierarchy of values, and we're putting our guy on top. And now you're going to have to do the same thing if you want to compete with us, which means that at the end, the thing that matters most to us, which is that the Christian hierarchy of values is completely eliminated, is no longer part of the story, will happen regardless of sort of which particular version of this actually ends up winning.
Just to drill into that. So even if America at that time was a Christian nation, and the people who were participating in all these different rungs of this new spirit or egregore or complex were all Christian in and of themselves, that over time, we know over time that there's no longer Christianity now, but there was Christianity at that point.
Right. Yeah. But did you watch the video that was part of that tweet? He talks in great, like really beautifully about the movement. So like in 1947, a radio show was created in the West called The Greatest Story Ever Told.
Yeah.
It's extremely successful. Successful enough that by the mid 60s, it becomes a major motion picture, or the 70s or something like that, with all kinds of stars in it. And that's a complete flop. Why is that? It's because the soul of the country, the spirit that we were actually living under, had now become this inverted, not Nazi. It had become a new secular hierarchy that was premised on this sacrifice, right? The sacrifice was made, the values hierarchy was produced, and it was an entirely secular values hierarchy. Christians could map themselves to it. Christians could say, well, I mean, yeah, I'm against killing people, so obviously that's fine. And I'm against tyranny, so that's fine. But the point was that you were no longer actually looking at it through the iconographic lens. You're looking at it through the idol lens. That's the key thing. Once that shift was made, we were there. And we've been living in it, right? So the key thing is this is what this guy spoke about, I think, quite lucidly. We've been living in a world that is ultimately, Hitler is the top of our values hierarchy. Our values hierarchy just happens to be operating in a mirror image. And the only way we can actually make sense of what is good is just by virtue of saying anti-evil. We don't have a positive vision of what is good. We have a negative vision of what is evil. Guess what?
Yeah.
That means we're literally in his world. That's how it works.
Yeah.
It's just that he has established himself as the actual top of the values hierarchy by virtue of being the one who defines all of the other values. All of the values defined by relationship to him, and ultimately then by the relationship to Nazis as a derivative, and then go further. And so that's the key move, right? We're now living in his world. We think we're living in our world because our version of what's happening, because that negative space looks a lot like our world. This is why it's so tricky, but we're not. And then more and more happen, right? So you got all these spirits that get produced, the military-industrial complex, and the arms race,
Military form,
the arms race of the Cold War, which turns schools into certain kinds of like an adjunct to the military-industrial complex, and science is an adjunct. Like everything begins to recenter on that kind of a thing, which is an extremely Nazi thing to do, right?
We hired a lot of them to get to the moon
because we had to fight with the communists who had adopted the same basic formal structure so that they can compete with the Nazis, right? So it's like, hey, I'll just turn you into a version of me, and I will establish myself as the top of your values hierarchy by causing you to live in a world where you're living in an upside down mirror image version of me. Yeah. But you don't have a top, you have a bottom, but that bottom is still the top upside down, like looking at it in a mirror.
It explains how the civil rights movement eventually became completely Nazified, in the sense that it's all procedure. It's affected through lawsuits. It's affected through laws. It's affected through formal order.
Yeah, that's right.
It strips us of our freedom of speech to a certain degree, for sure, but of association. Like in the material world, you no longer have freedom of association. You have to these diversity quotas and stuff like that. It's the liberal value, but it's instantiated through a technocratic optimization, and it becomes a god in of itself.
Yeah. You end up living in a Nazi state that identifies itself as being perfectly anti-Nazi.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And I don't mean, by the way, we're currently living in it right now completely, but the trajectory we've been on has been in that direction, as you say, as you kind of watch different pieces fall away. What's left reveals what has been the real attractor, what's been pulling us towards that. And now you can kind of double click, like take a look at what happened to science. Oh, okay. I can see what happened to science. What happened to healthcare? Like you can look at it all. We can even see like the way that you can get these beautiful mask come off moments, like what happened during COVID. You're like, that's kind of weird. We don't actually seem to live in a world where human relationships are at the bottom and persons are persons, and the values are the values that I thought we had. And we actually kind of live in this really real world where
during that time people became vectors of disease. Like that's how we defined each other as super spreaders. That's how we looked at each other. Like
disgusting vectors of disease that needed.
Yeah, we were constantly washing our hands and
state to control them and eliminate them so that they didn't infect the rest of society with their degeneracy.
Yeah.
In fact, I think we also started getting public indicators of our status in terms of degeneracy. I know that in order to fly, I had to show them my card that indicated that I was less degenerate than I could otherwise have been. And by the way, I don't know if you recall, but in many parts of the Anglosphere, Australia in particular, there was plenty of calls for camps for these people, right? And so the key is like that's conscious. That's an unconscious image. Right? The image is there. It's latent. It's kind of sitting out in the periphery. And the thing that I want to point at them and focus on is this notion of the difference between living in an idol, an idolatry values hierarchy, and also therefore also one that's secular, and then living in one that's iconographic, right? So the content matters, but the key thing is that once you're living in one, you're not living in the other, and once you're living in one, you're in something that's going to die. So back to the beginning of our conversation, and we're now at the end of it. It's dying. Where the post-war order, the post-war identity is in the process of falling apart because it can't not fall apart. Like it's just not that kind of thing. A cut flower will eventually just turn into goo. It's fun, by the way. Oh, go ahead.
It's interesting that the left agitated for it, and now the right's starting to agitate for it. The left started to purposely undermine the order with through critical theory, through a certain version of postmodernism, deconstructing colonialism identities, formulating, taking the idea that Nazis bad, and diluting what it means to be a Nazi to attach it to any formal identity, and then inverting those structures of oppression, or labeling all these things as oppression. And then now the right's being called to participate in that game and to declare identity and to declare a hierarchy of identity. And if the right gets it wrong, it's going to be pretty bad, but the right still has to do it to some degree.
Oh, it's so another way of saying idol and icon is power and love. So if you're not fully living in the icon, if you're not fully living in that which is governed by love, then you're living in that which is governed by power. And that's just a matter of time before somebody who's more capable of accruing and deploying power, the military industrial complex, is deploying that power against you. And what's left is, if you didn't get killed in that move, you might get smarter and say, "Ooh, I'm going to drop all this other shit and actually focus on how do I win the next fight because I don't want to be a loser." Because there's really no other part of the world. Like there's nothing left on the landscape. So you've got winners and losers, and those winners, losers, and prey. Let's put it that way. And so the winner eats the prey. The loser was the prey, but the loser might have survived enough that he wasn't actually consumed. Now he's in the game of trying to become a winner. So think about Stalin after the Operation Barbarossa. And he's like, wow, I need to figure out my game in the domain of power. I actually understand power, but now I'm really having to play it. And so it is inevitable that when the left, you have division, right? You got two teams. One team starts playing by the rules of power more fundamentally. The other team spends a while being prey until those portions that are either tired of being prey or survived enough to be able to say, I don't want to be prey anymore, begin to harden. Then the question is, very practical, can they identify new ways to play with power that are more functional? So let's leap back to 2016. Because the internet had produced a new shape to the battlefield, the elements of the right that had decided to no longer be prey had the ability to produce this crazy insurgency known as the first Trump administration, which was a very loose, I wrote about this actually very specifically, a very loose thing that didn't have a lot of order and construction, but it had a very high rate of innovation because it wasn't yoked to old styles of play. And so, and then the battle goes on, right? And both sides now for the past several years have been in this process of innovation. And of course, there aren't even sides as you see every time something moves. What was the one that happened recently on the right? Oh, it was, as you said, the college students or whatever, the young Republicans. Okay, so that's a kind of a move in the field of war, because we're in fifth generation warfare, by the way. So it doesn't look like World War II. It looks like
until somebody gets shot, then we revert back to something even more powerful.
Well, people get shot in fifth generation warfare. It's just not principally about shooting lots of people initially. You're shaping operations and psyops.
Stochastic terrorism.
Stochastic terrorism is a fundamental tool. And then if it turns out that actually deploying focused force, so it's not like move back to like fourth generation, you've got, sometimes you kill a bunch of terrorists. That's a move. And sometimes you actually declare war on Ukraine. Like that still is part of what's happening. I hope everybody recognizes that war in Ukraine is a much bigger thing, and there's a lot more going on than what's happening on the battlefield. Obviously, otherwise it would have been over years ago.
Yeah.
And I mean, we can also throw in the spiritual warfare aspects if we'd like, but we can stay focused pretty practically. And so the co-evolutionary dynamics are what they are. And then what you end up having then is something like the natural archetypes. This is why the right tends to vector towards fascism and the left tends to vector towards Maoism. The natural archetypes just happen to be different. And so if you tend to be a little bit more towards the right, you will evolve further and further in that direction because that's the direction where your strengths will lie. And if you happen to be more and more on the left, you'll kind of vector in that direction and your strengths will lie. So you'll end up being more towards a Maoist, and on the right, you'll be more towards a fascist, because that's kind of like the low energy point at what the most successful strategic ways of deploying power operate.
Yeah. What does the center do? How does the center vie? What's the proper path forward, I guess, is what I'm trying
there is no
to...
center. The center is just characterized by naivete and stupidity until a new identity is formed.
Yes.
All right. When the old identity is falling apart, there is no center. The center exists as a consequence of being part of a whole. When the identity is dying, there is no center. There's just disaggregated parts that are looking for a place to be. So if you
the
were
politically homeless, the left me's.
Yeah, exactly. So if you happen to be part of the old center, let's say, and you don't want to be part of the power dynamic, then the only way forward is to try to figure out how to participate in the formation of a new identity.
Yeah.
And here then I have the bad news. Remember, go all the way back. How does identity formation work? Well, you got path 1 on the left, sacrifice. Path 2 on the right, participation in the church. In the West, that's it. That's all you got. You got 2 choices. And path 1 on the left, sacrifice, is going to be a lot. It's going to be a serious sacrifice. And probably a lot of people will be sacrificed on the altar of whatever pagan god positions itself as being the new idol, however we describe it. In the current environment, mostly in the West, looks like the robot or the machine. The AI machine, the robot machine, the cyborg, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And the cyborg theocracy, that's what it looks like most likely on the left. As Dugan points out, Russia is not the West, and China is not the West. China could devolve and evolve, there's both directions, into a new version of Chinese civilization, which would be something like a very straightforward, honest pagan, ethno-pagan environment. The spirit is the celestial emperor who has the mandate of heaven in the Middle Kingdom, right? They've done that 7 times. They kind of know how it works, and they're more or less building that. And they've done it so many times that I'm sure they're aware of how to navigate the expansion and contraction, or the death and life cycle of that. Totally. In fact, they will pull card. They'll look at it and say, okay, which one are we doing now? Like, oh, we're more like the Tang. Okay, great. Pull that, that dossier on how the Tang do their thing. We're going to have to radically renovate Taoism, Confucianism. We're going to have to figure out how to iterate that kind of a thing. Okay. So, for example, like these are like what the actual trajectories look like in the U.S. or in the West. It looks like something like transhumanism or the machine, which, by the way, is just liberalism run to its full, like in its final form, kind of the last Pokemon, or the church, right? Welcome to the West. Like that's like just take the whole history of the West, boil the last 1,000 years down to its raw components. That's what you got left. And then there's other places in the world where you might have different trajectories based upon their particulars in this moment in time.
Well, what is the church then? Can you give me an understanding of what that would look like?
Well, think about it from the point of view of Helene. So the church would be kind of this habit, this deep habit, and this implicit source from which narrative can come, and from which and that narrative is now anchored in the transcendent and grounded in a sacrifice that is deeper, right? So the sacrifice is distributed through the church and doesn't look like a pagan sacrifice. The blood has been spilled already. And then the form, which is really interesting, will be produced by the relationships of the people themselves in real time. So it won't look like any of the existing church forms, although it will include them in many powerful, important ways. It will also, there will be new forms that will be developed because we live in a new world. Right? When the Holy Spirit is poured into the body of the Byzantine Empire and poured into the body of the Latin Empire and poured into the body of Northern Europe in 0, 1000, and 1500, that the local context matters, and the church forms in a particular way. It's like pouring molten silver into water. Right? You get a shape. Or if you'd like egg duck soup, if you're a little bit more practical. And so it will look like that. And again, like what I saw in Helene was when the secular institutional structure just went away, and we were grounded in the body of the church. And I mean that capital C, not lowercase c. Then what happened was we just began to spontaneously self-organize on the basis of what was happening. And over time, by the way, different kinds of more formal institutional structures began to emerge. Certain parts of the recovery area said, no, we're actually just going to be handling things like clothes. And other groups said, yeah, we don't want to handle clothes. And so they shifted there. You start having meta structures. So the form will be a new kind of form. And by the way, I can go into that in a lot of detail, and most of which is sketchy, but it'll be a new kind of form. And the heart, right, the narrative, we already know the narrative. The narrative has already been told. We'll be telling that narrative in a new way because it'll be more alive, because it will be connected with the source of the narrative as opposed to the fifth sequel. But that's what it looks like on the church side.
So to go way back, at one point you were talking about what is an American. So an American has got to be, I guess you're laying it out. Is an American a consumer and a wielder of fantastic technologies, or is an American a churchgoer with a cell phone?
Okay, that's nice. That's true. That's a fair distinction. Yeah, I mean, what you're basically saying is an American a participant in a free trade zone, or is an American an identity that has a spirit? Yeah. Well, both right now. I mean, the confusing part is that some people think it means one thing and some people think it means another thing. And they're both kind of arguing from their point of view. So you see, for example, the H-1B visa argument. Just look at kind of like
propositional nation.
The semantics of what is considered to be a valid argument is telling you that there's actually two different value hierarchies that are communicating to each other, and they haven't established the fact that we actually have completely different values. We're talking about two different identities here. Like if the identity structure is we're building a competitive, commercial, technical, military machine, and therefore want and need to pluck the best and the brightest from everywhere in the world, regardless of the consequences that has for them or for us in any other domain other than building bigger, faster, smarter, then that's one argument. And therefore we should be doing this like this. If the argument is something different, like we raise our kids here, we grow old here. We want to live and die here. We want to be able to establish rituals and traditions and aesthetics that match to what human beings actually love and care about. Then it's just a different set of arguments, right? You might reach the same conclusion, or you might reach a tacit agreement. But the point is, they're actually completely different identities. And I think the question of what is an American has not yet actually been properly asked, to be perfectly honest.
I ask people.
Ever.
Really
no, I mean like all the way back. Like,
well, Tocqueville described something very similar to what you were describing with Helene, the hurricane.
Well, think about it. One of the ways I've thought about it recently is in the context of the church. Like why is America a Protestant nation? Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is because it was a frontier. And it was a rapidly unfolding frontier, which meant that it needed an institutional form that could actually move pretty quickly and could be relatively polymorphic in adapting itself to the context it found itself in. And you weren't going to be able to pull that off with orthodoxy, which is the slowest and the most rigid in terms of really it only moves into whole existing civilizations and kind of turns them from black to white all at once. And you also couldn't do it particularly well with Catholicism, right? Which has its own particular way of moving. Its scaling factor is slower. Okay, so that's one reason. So one characteristic of America, we look at the history. We can also look at the fact that
Just on the point of Catholicism, there is a reason why South America, or everything south of us, went Catholic
yes,
via the Crusades, via a certain type of movement and growth.
yeah, well, it's ultimately has to do with the nature of Spain and how Spain was operating, and the fact that magically enough, South America was not a subject to colonization primarily, but was a subject of resource extraction primarily, and therefore a foundation of an adjunct, resource extraction function was the primary base, and the Spanish Empire was built around that set of premises. And then, as people started moving in, they moved into that infrastructure, which was in fact a completely Catholic infrastructure, fully established before any real population began to grow.
Okay.
And you can see the same thing with, say, Mexico and the mestizos and all that kind of stuff. But the North America had no advantages in terms of why you could get beaver fur pelts, as the French tried to run the Spanish model in North America, and it really was a non-starter. Whereas
they
British
didn't have oil extraction at that point. It would have been a different
would have been a different story. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you also have this really interesting problem that we don't actually have. There's no nation. We're not a nation state in any ordinary sense, because we don't have a shared ethnos. We don't have a shared language, and we don't have a shared identity in the simple sense. We're not clan. There's not like one big clan that we can't trace ourselves all the way back. Like our father and our founding father is an abstraction. Well, the only reason why that can happen is in the context of the Christian church. The Christian church is by the way, Islamic. Right? You've got two major ways of handling a universal, non-ethnic identity that becomes a nation. You can play a little bit in some of the other major religions, but those are the two that really do that by nature. Right?
Yeah.
That's what we do.
So in a sense, the United States can't be a nation without being Christian nation, because it can't scale its identity without that Christian foundation.
And liberalism isn't strong enough to hold that.
No, it's not.
Liberalism can kind of buy you off for a while.
Yeah.
But once the ability to buy you off has been going to ground down, either because you're too obese to continue to consume more calories or because the gears have gotten too rusty, then that version of the story breaks down. Like the merchant prince isn't a real, actual sovereign. And so, that's another way of telling the same story. Now, again, transhumanism says, no. I mean, in some sense, this is what Thiel is arguing. He's arguing kind of a Girardian reset, but basically, we need to continue to be able to buy peace. And the only way we can buy peace is we have to 1,000x our technical capability. The next industrial revolution is before us. Take whatever comes as a consequence. Right. So the fact that so in fact, if you can, spin it as a positive, convert human nature into a maximally liquid commodity. You will actually be able to buy 4 arms, or actually able to buy, obviously brain machine interface. And the advantage is that can allow us to maintain something that holds this thing together, not really as a nation under an icon, but that's the idol. We could form a new idol, and we make a sacrifice. Now, what do we sacrifice? All of our children. That's what we sacrifice. It's a comprehensive Moloch sacrifice on the blood altar.
How do you figure?
There will be no capacity for humans to be human on the other side of that. You'll be having, I'm not kidding, like the vision of vat-born children, the notion of people being raised by robots and AI, not by parents. Just think about how hard, you've got kids, yeah?
Yeah.
And think about how hard it is to be a parent. And think about how hard it is if you're not a very well-trained parent, that your kids don't really have a model of parenting, and then they enter into a culture which is antenatal in every direction. What's going to happen to their kids? And their kids are in fact raised by mostly AIs and robots and media, and they just take one step, and most of the people around them are now brain chip. Humanity is over as a humanity, which, by the way, many of the folks on that side think that's perfectly fine, right? To be a transhumanist in some sense is just to ultimately say, no, the thing human is an intermediary step for just pure abstract intelligence. So, you hit super AGI, and everybody uploads their consciousness, and and ended the human story as such.
Yeah, and there's a God there, the God of the algorithm.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Intelligence. The God is intelligence.
I know you have a hard out in like 10 minutes. We didn't finish. We went so many different places, but I want to respectfully bring us back to Israel, because on the left, Israel represents colonialism, and on the right, Israel represents, it seems to represent, if you take the anti-Semitism out of the equation, it seems to represent what the right really wants is an ethno-state, is some sort of identity. Like if Britain can have Israel level of internal cohesive identity, it will avoid what's going to happen, which is Britain no longer existing as Britain. It's just a completely laid to waste economic zone. And so you were talking about how Jerusalem is the center of the world, and that there's this tension between the secular and the religious, the mythological and the procedural going on right now. It could be the case that whatever tensions lie on Israel are tensions that can show us how this story can complete in America. Like that switch from that two path between the idolizing ethnicity, idolizing the state, idolizing the colony, or understanding that the colony, the state, and the ethnos is a reflection of who we are as a people in service to the transcendent. I don't know. I'm kind of spitballing.
Well, I mean, we say, like, you read the Old Testament. Obviously, I'll call it that, the Torah, if you want to come from the other direction, the Pentateuch. It's kind of about nothing other, ultimately, at the end of the day, about this tension of idolatry versus what I'm calling the icon. Right? God is continuously saying, hey, stop worshiping foreign gods. Stop trying to become a nation unto yourselves. Remember the story of Babylon? So in the story of Babel, we kind of Sunday school focus on the tower, but it's the sentence, this phrase before that that's actually the key message, which is they sought to make a name for themselves, comma, therefore they built a tower. The tower is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And in the end, it wasn't necessarily to go up high. The end was to make a name for themselves. What does it mean to make a name for yourselves? Name here is basically the same thing as spirit, same thing as identity, right? So a secular nation state makes a name for itself. Babylon, right? Babylon makes a name for itself. Yeah. And so if you look at kind of the heart or essence of Israel, secular nation state, it's almost yet another loop, right? It's absolutely perfectly represents the thing that nothing that the Torah says, definitely don't do that ever. Like, that's absolutely the worst possible thing you could do, is to do that. You're worshiping foreign gods and trying to make a name for yourself, and the wrath of God is going to come as a consequence, inevitably. Right? It's just like, so the thing that makes it valid as an answer to the question of why would it exist at all, which is to say there's something like an actual identity. Right? Jews aren't the same as, say, Puerto Ricans or Italians. Right? They have like, no, we have an identity that has this weird history, but the grounding of this history is this guy named Abraham, and then ultimately Jacob, and then ultimately us, and the God of Jacob, right? The God of Abraham, and that's like what makes it an ethnos that would have an appropriate identity, and yet it is embodied as a nation state, which represents the actual antithesis of that in the actual narrative of God himself. Okay, that's complicated, which is why, for example, you get lots of Orthodox Jews in the United States protest against this. For pretty straightforward reasons. They're like, hey, the prophecies tell us not to do that. But then, as you say, from the point of view of those who like the idea of ethno-state, the notion of God's chosen people, like the one, whatever, there's 70 nations, and okay, each of those nations is a proper ethno-state post Babel, and so and Israel is the kind of the exemplar of that, because they were the one that God himself chose. Okay, so everybody else who wants to look like that to become a proper ethno-state needs to look like them as an image, because they were carved out of this diaspora and concentrated with this powerful move. Like, when I went to Israel, it was amazing to see all of these people who looked completely different from each other. Because some of them were plucked from Yemen, and other ones were plucked from Russia. And like, wow, and yet they're all, no, we're Israeli. So I get that. And then we could do the same thing, by the way. So if you look at it on the left, you have Israel is the margin, the excluded, particularly in the history of the West, not the absolute exemplar of the excluded, which then is the archetype of the left. But then you also have Israel nation state as the colonizer. Oh, okay. So that they represent both sides of the equation, in some sense, even in the West, perfectly. You've got kind of the African slave trade as being the other version of the excluded, which then gives rise to what does that look like as a nation state.
Yeah.
And then on the right, you have Israel as the fulfillment, the eschaton, right? Israel as the New Jerusalem, Israel, and then you have Israel as the nation state, right? The fighter jets and Moshe Dayan with the eye patch, right? And it's all of that, right? It's all of those things. So if you look at it, it says, yeah, this is the image of the full complexity of what's going on.
And it was born through World War II, and so it is the prophecy. It's very like Revelation. It's like very like these dispensationalists, like it's already happened. It's already happened.
It's the alpha and the omega of the World War II post-war narrative.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm sorry. We don't have enough time. I was going to say you can actually take a look at even just like the geopolitical practicalities of why one might imagine Israel's hand is forced, like why it had to behave the way that it behaved. Like it's not random as far as I can tell, but that's not true. It just talks about the fact that at the end of the secular cycle, all of the chips have to be played. And because, when the reset comes, you need to be in a position of maximum leverage.
I don't know how to end. How do we end, Jordan? Where do we... You said that America hasn't really asked what we are yet. I'm wondering if that's correct to even ask, if we invented a system of federalism so we don't have to, or we staved off that question, and then the wars and the Civil War and the World War II and the frontier, all these things that were outside of us suspended us asking that question. And we get in trouble whenever that question comes too close to home.
Yeah, it's really great. So if you think about the history, we have this concept of the New Deal. And we have that actually several times. They're named different things, right? We have the New Frontier and whatever there was before Roosevelt. I think there were 2 or 3 before that. And of course, you have the very beginning. You have the actual Mayflower Compact, and then you have the Articles of Confederation. Is that what it was called?
Yeah.
The original?
Well, they sound like a bunch of treaties. Like we're very legalistic. We're very like...
We're liberal.
Yeah.
It's liberal. But there's something that's not liberal, and that's a covenant. And so I think the answer might actually come all the way down to that, which is there any version of America that is not legalistic? Because again, if there isn't, then the technocratic transhumanists is the only game in town. And and then that's just where it is. That's the play. Anything on the other side of that is something that is not legalistic in nature, and yet is also simultaneously American. It's a good way to end.
Okay. Jordan, always just profoundly grateful for getting the chance to speak with you. I hope to see you in person again.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Do you have anything? No?
No.
Okay. Where can people find you? Do you have anything in the pipes coming down?
Nope. I don't. I try not to do anything. The only time I do anything is when somebody like you reaches out and says, "Hey, can we talk?"
Yeah.
So don't find me if at all possible. If you do find me, don't do anything. But if absolutely necessary, maybe we could talk.
You're like the A-team.
Yeah, there you go. Yes, absolutely. I'm all members of the A-team simultaneously.
I'll put it away. All right, man. Thank you so much. God bless you. I hope your wife and children are doing good, and the bottleneck, the flood has reset your community, and you guys are really bound and able to be a springboard for wonderful things to come.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah. Blessings to you and your family as well.
Excellent. All right. I'll end the recording.